Hello, everyone. I stand before you as a son of two Native American nations. On my mother's side, I'm Pascua Yaqui from Arizona. And on my father's side, I'm from the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in South Dakota. Now, when I was young, my elders would tell me stories, like many Indigenous elders do. So one day, my father pulled me aside, and he taught me about a principle that spanned time and space. He called it the seventh generation ethic. The seventh generation ethic is a social and spiritual contract. It says that we must know our past, but that in our actions, we must consider the impacts upon future generations, upon those who will follow us 7 generations from now. Now, this principle has allowed my tribe and my people to thrive since time immemorial. It has profoundly impacted the way I live my own life, has the power to influence yours, and can guide our world today. Now, the 7th generation principle, according to what my father told me, is a sacred responsibility. It says that everything we do will have an impact on future generations. So we bear responsibility to them today and always. It also tells us that we should honor the 7 generations already around us. And just think about it. The 3 before us, our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, our own generation, and the 3 generations after us, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. My people integrate this value into our daily lives through a phrase, matakuasan, which means all my relations. We say this phrase at the end of every single one of our prayers, and it reminds us at all times to honor all of our relations, past, present, and future. And for us, these relations are not just our human relatives. We strive to understand how we relate to all of creation, to the water, to the air, the plants, the animals, and to the Creator. Now, Indigenous peoples all around the world think intergenerationally as well. Take Aboriginal peoples, who honor elders past, present, and future in their traditional acknowledgments. For Indigenous peoples, this way of thought brings our ancestors and the unborn to life in a living generational framework that guides the way in which we carry ourselves. As an Indigenous youth, this value is very real to me. I grew up with hardship. My family lived paycheck to paycheck. The area I grew up in and my school offered easy access to drugs and gang life, and I got involved in that too. Most of my friends from that time of my life ended up in prison or jail. Now, what kept me strong was intergenerational resilience in the form of both blessings and trauma. It was the stories that my elders told me about my ancestors and being on the same land and loving it the way that they loved it. It was my ceremonies, passed down thousands of years. Hearing my grandmother, fierce woman, carrying the memories of my people, tell me how sad she was because our language was endangered. Reading in a news article that my language could die by 2050. My family and friends being criminalized for being Indigenous activists. Watching my relatives struggle with alcoholism, suicide, and drug addictions. And knowing in my heart that this was intergenerational trauma. And it's also the story of my people's wars. In 1533, a Yaqui warrior from my tribe drew a line in the sand and proclaimed to the European invaders, up until this line, and as far as you can see in these 3 directions, is Yaqui land. No one will be allowed to enter. For 500 years, my people have battled 3 separate government armies. We've lived through slave labor. We've lived through deportations. We lived through massacres, policy of extermination and genocide. My great-grandmother survived by hiding her and her little brother behind a rock while the army massacred her village. If she hadn't have hid, or if the soldiers found her, I wouldn't be here right now. It's a miracle that I am here. I wasn't supposed to be here, but we made it. And because I am here, I want to honor the sacrifices that my ancestors made. I have a cultural obligation to live my life for others, past, present, and future. The two questions I ask myself when I feel like giving up are, how are you living up to the dreams of your ancestors? And how will future generations know that you loved them? Now, for me, I want to become a doctor so I can help my communities. But for the past 5 years, I've been a delegate at the United Nations, working in the Indigenous space. In that time, I've had the greatest privilege of working with Indigenous leaders from over 70 different countries. And besides never failing to be late for meetings, I've realized that no matter where you go, whether it be Botswana, Australia, Parramatta, Indigenous peoples share this intergenerational outlook on life. And it's reflected in the way that we carry ourselves. Our extended family systems that honor the role of every generation of youth, children, adults. Elders have an important role where we say, even if someone isn't able to work, they're still able to have value in our communities. Now, these values, they keep our worlds going, these intergenerational values. And the world attempts to castigate Indigenous peoples as culturally backwards. But the evidence suggests that when it comes to sustainability and planning, Indigenous nations are the most advanced nations in the entire world. 80% of the biodiversity left on our planet today is situated in Indigenous-controlled territories. Think about that. Despite Indigenous peoples being 5% of the global population, that's no accident. When it comes to planning and sustainability and caretaking for future generations, our intergenerational awareness is the highest form of politics. Now, as the world attempts to castigate Indigenous peoples as culturally backwards, Indigenous peoples are constantly fighting for our world with these intergenerational values. And to get you in this intergenerational mindset, I want everyone in this room to take a second and to think about some of the world's greatest historical leaders. What's one thing that they all have in common? They created positive intergenerational change. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Crazy Horse, leaders from Australia that I haven't learned about. Their legacies have lived on because their impacts have transcended time. Their actions improved life for us today. So when we look into the past, we evaluate and judge people and society through this intergenerational lens with intergenerational criteria. Why don't we do the same today? Why don't we expect our politicians and governments to think about future generations? That's a question I want everyone in this room to think about. And these intergenerational values, when you think about it, they can sound mystical. They can sound like something you might hear at a Woodstock festival. But they're actually quite logical. My people, the chiefs of my tribe, used to meet and have special councils where they would specifically take time to discuss and plan for future generations. Why don't we have our politicians today do the same thing? You know, we have to think as a society, what will our legacy be in 100 years? What will they think about us? Will we be the generation that allowed bees to go extinct? Will we be the generation that allowed the continuity of the mass incarceration of minorities all around the world? The generation that couldn't figure out a way to establish a system that gives women and men equal pay for equal work? The generation that relatively had more homeless people than ever before in human history? We can change this trajectory. We can do more. Like I said before, this value is integrated in Indigenous ways. Our leaders were elected because we trusted them with future generations, and they actually put it to practice in these meetings where they would plan. What if we expected the people we put in power, what if we expected them to produce a report on future generations, grounded in both Indigenous knowledge and modern science? What if we evaluated our leaders through this intergenerational criteria? What if before voting, we took a few seconds to think about future generations? Now, these values, they're still practiced by Indigenous peoples, even today. But instead of being celebrated, we're criminalized. The Indigenous pregnant mother I met at Standing Rock in South Dakota, peacefully protesting the DAPL pipeline, who had a flash grenade explode right next to her. Some of my mentors at the United Nations, who are labeled terrorists. My Indigenous mentor from Mexico, peacefully protesting to ensure her community's water supply, and brutally attacked for it. Indigenous peoples are this world's vigilantes. We're heroes. We put our lives on the line to protect some of the last natural places on Earth, not just for us, but for everyone. Continually criminalized for protecting future generations. Now more than ever, our world needs these Indigenous values. See, for Indigenous peoples, it doesn't matter if someone isn't alive yet, if someone's not born yet, because what we do can still allow them to suffer. And just because they're not alive yet, and just because we might be dead, doesn't make that suffering any less real. The seventh generation value, this way of thinking, I believe, is the mark of a mature nation. Just think about it. Most of the world's oldest societies practice it. It's a human code in that nations who do not consider the impacts of their practices and decisions on future generations are morally negligent. And similarly, societies that don't understand and comprehend how their present conditions are the way they are because of the impacts of preceding generations can easily become passive in the face of intergenerational oppression. Now, I would like to talk about the personal applications of the seventh generation principle, which calls us to know where we came from, so we know where we are and we know where we're going. Here are 5 personal applications that we can all use in our own lives. First one is storytelling. I'd like to encourage everyone here to tell young generation stories, preferably, if possible, in your native languages. Something funny, sad, that can be held close to the heart and that will be passed on to future generations. This is essential to the continuity of a culture and the strength of a community, and to developing intergenerational thinkers. The second one, reconciliation. Study your ancestors, study your own history, but study mine as well. In school, we're all required to learn European history. But we're lucky if we spend a day or a couple days on Indigenous history. How are we supposed to work together and understand each other if I know your history but you don't know mine? This is essential if we want to reconcile intergenerational systems of oppression together. Number 3, respect for Indigenous peoples. Wherever you live, learn the names of the Indigenous communities around you. If you're traveling, or even if you're stable, living in somewhere for a long time, get to know and familiarize yourself with the local Aboriginal land councils or traditional owners, and even go as far as to ask them for their blessing. Imagine how much goodwill that could create. Number 4, prayer and action. For my people, prayer is one of the most powerful things we could do. And we often include future generations in our prayers. Like I said before, matakiwasan. If you pray, I challenge you to include future generations in your prayers. I challenge you to pray that their world will look better than our world, and then act on your prayers. Number 5, respect for women. In our society, history is often told and imagined from the perspective of men. This gives the impression that women have less to offer society, going into the future and into the past. In order to create a better society for everyone, we need the full picture. Right now, we're missing more than half of it. So study your ancestors, but focus on the women as well. What did your grandmothers want? What did your great-grandmothers want? What were their visions? This excerpt is from The Vanishing Race, the last great Indian council. Chief Bear Ghost, with great calmness and deliberation, said, I am glad that I am here to shake the hand in peace with all the chiefs of the various tribes assembled. It is a great day for me. It is a great day for us all. I rejoice that a record of this council will be made, that it may live for future generations. That it may live for future generations. Chief Bear Ghost, he's my great-great-grandfather. Even in the highest councils of my people, my ancestors were thinking of me, thinking of us. Why don't we do the same? Thank you.